Kicked out at 14, he bought an abandoned house in the U.S. What he found inside changed everything. Mateo was 14 when he was kicked out with nothing but a backpack and a warning not to come back. Years later, undocumented and broke, he bought an abandoned house no one else wanted and no inspections. No questions. Just silence. The first night inside, the floor creaked even when he stood still in a sealed closet. He found a child's drawing taped to the wall. Same house. Same room. One figure crossed out. Why would someone hide this, and who was erased from it? Mateo stood in the doorway longer than he needed to, the key still warm in his hand, listening to the house breathe. The creaking hadn't stopped when he froze. It only softened, like something adjusting to his presence. He closed the closet slowly, the drawing still burned into his vision, and stepped back in the narrow hallway where the air smelled faintly of dust and old with soaked by years of rain. His chest felt tight, not from fear exactly, but from a familiar sense of being somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He told himself it was just an old house settling. He had slept in worse places. Under bridges where trucks shook the concrete all night, in basements where the ceiling dripped onto his shoes. Still, this felt different. This house didn't feel empty. It felt paused. He walked toward the kitchen, each step deliberate, testing the floor as if it might answer back. When he reached the sink, he turned the handle without expecting anything, and the sudden cough of rusty water made him jump. The sound grounded him. Running water meant pipes. Pipes meant someone once cared enough to fix them. He let the water run until it cleared, watching the brown fade to gray, and with it, some of the panic in his chest. He washed his hands slowly, scrubbing as if the day itself were stuck to his skin, and told himself again that he was safe. He owned this place, at least on paper. No one could kick him out tonight. He dragged his backpack into the living room and sat on the floor, back against a wall that was cooler than he expected. The room was bare except for a broken lamp, and a couch collapsed inward like it had given up. Mateo pulled out his only blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Hunger gnawed at him, but exhaustion won. As he lay there, the house clicked inside, each noise tugging at memories he tried not to touch. His mother silenced the night he was told to leave, the way no one asked where he slept after that. Sometime after midnight, a sound cut through his half-sleep. Not a creak, a soft thud, followed by a faint scraping. Mateo sat up, heart pounding, listening. It came again from the same direction as the closet. He stood, every instinct screaming to stay still, and took a step down the hallway. The air felt colder there, heavier, like it carried something unfinished. The closet door was exactly as he had left it, closed. He opened it again, faster this time, expecting nothing and everything at once. The drawing was still there, edges curling slightly. But beneath it, something new caught his eye. A faint outline on the wall, where the paint was a different shade, as if another piece of paper had once been taped there for a long time. Mateo reached out and touched the wall. The paint flaked under his fingers, revealing pencil marks pressed deep into plaster. Lines. A second drawing, erased but not gone. His stomach dropped as he realized this wasn't just a child's picture that had been hidden. Something had been deliberately removed. He stepped back, breath shallow, a decision forming even as he tried to ignore it. He hadn't bought shelter alone. He had bought a question. And for the first time since he was 14, Mateo felt the pull of staying. Not just because he had nowhere else to go, but because this place was asking him to listen. Morning arrived without sunlight. Mateo woke to a gray dimness pressing to the grime-coated windows, the kind of light that made time feel stalled. His back ached from the floor, and for a few seconds he didn't know where he was. Then the smell of old would return, and with it the memory of the closet, the drawing, the erased lines beneath the paint. His chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't fear that kept him still. It was something closer to responsibility, though he didn't yet know to whom. He stood slowly, listening for sound that didn't belong to the house itself. There were none. No footsteps outside, no voices, no passing cars. The neighborhood felt abandoned, too, a stretch of forgotten lots and sagging houses on the edge of a shrinking Midwestern town he'd chosen because it asked fewer questions. Somewhere in Ohio, though he rarely said the state's name out loud, as if it might anchor him to a place that still felt temporary. Mateo washed his face in the sink again, the water now clearer, colder. He caught his reflection in a cracked mirror above the basin. 26 years old, dark circles under his eyes, jaw clenched even at rest. He had learned young that relaxation was a luxury. When you could be sent away at any moment, you stayed ready. That readiness had followed him across borders, across nights spent pretending not to exist. He went back to the closet with a sense of purpose that surprised him. The drawing looked smaller in daylight, less haunting, but no less intentional. 2 stick figures stood under a crooked roof, one scratched out with thick, angry lines. The remaining figure had a round head and long arms that almost touched the erased one, as if reaching. Mateo crouched, studying the pencil pressure, the unevenness of a child's hand. Whoever had drawn this had been old enough to understand absence, young enough to express it this way. He peeled the tape carefully, the paper resisting as if it didn't want to leave. Behind it, the wall told more of the story. The faint second drawing was clearer now. 3 figures this time, one smaller than the others, all standing in a row. The erased one in the top, drawing a line with the smallest figure below. A child. The realization hit Mateo hard, a dull ache spreading through his chest. This wasn't random vandalism. This was memory being buried. He spent the rest of the morning exploring the house, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to understand the space that had held this secret. In the back bedroom, he found a rusted bed frame and a single sock shoved into a corner, stiff with age. In the bathroom, a medicine cabinet hung open, empty except for a cracked plastic comb. Nothing valuable, nothing anyone would steal. The kind of things left behind when leaving wasn't a choice. By noon, hunger forced him outside. The air was damp, the sky low and threatening rain. He walked to a small grocery store a few blocks away, the kind with flickering fluorescent lights and handwritten signs. The cashier, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes, watched him with mild suspicion soften into something like recognition. "You buy that old Carter place?" she asked as she rang up his bread and soup. Mateo hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, cheap." She snorted quietly. "Everything's cheap if no one wants it." She handed him the bag, then paused. "You be careful in there." "Why?" The word slipped out before he could stop it. She shrugged, already turning to the next customer. "House got history. Not the good kind." Back at the house, rain began to fall, light at first, then steady. The sound against the roof felt intimate, like the house responding to his return. Mateo ate standing up, staring out the window at the overgrown yard. History, the word echoed in him. He had spent years running from his own, keeping it folded tight inside so it wouldn't slow him down. But this house had no such instinct. Its past leaked through walls and floors, insistent. He decided to look for records. It wasn't a grand plan, just something to do that wasn't sitting with unanswered questions. The county office was a bus ride away, a low building that smelled of paper and stale coffee. He kept his head down, answered only what was asked. Name, address, reason, ownership record republic, the clerk said, sliding a folder across the counter with practiced indifference. The house had changed hands 3 times in 20 years. Before that, it had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Carter for nearly 4 decades. No mention of children in the brief notes, just a line about unpaid taxes and eventual foreclosure after her death. Mateo traced the name with his finger. Eleanor. He tried to imagine her, old and alone, in that house full of echoes. On the bus ride back, his mind wandered his own childhood, to the night his mother avoided his eyes while his stepfather spoke for her. "You're old enough," he'd said. Figured out. No explanation. No warning beyond the finality in his voice. Mateo had slept that first night in a laundromat, the hum of machines filling the silence his family left behind. He wondered, not for the first time, how different his life might have been if someone had stayed. The rain had stopped by the time he returned. The house looked smaller somehow, less imposing, as if daylight had stripped it of some power. He unlocked the door and went straight to the closet again, this time bringing a screwdriver he'd found in the kitchen drawer. Carefully, he scraped away more paint around the faint lines. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing deeper grooves beneath. Words emerged. Not many. A name carved with the same uneven pressure as the drawing. Samuel. Mateo sat back on his heels, heart racing. A name made it real in a way pictures couldn't. Samuel had existed. Samuel had been here. And someone had tried very hard to make sure he was forgotten. The realization stirred something fierce in Mateo, a quiet anger mixed with sorrow. He knew what it meant to be erased, to have your place in the story crossed out, because it was inconvenient. As evening fell, the house grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less oppressive, more expectant. Mateo covered the scraped wall with a cloth, not to hide it, but to protect it. He didn't know why yet, only that it mattered. He lay down on the floor once more, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around him. He thought about the cashier's warning, about Eleanor Carter, about Samuel. He thought about himself, undocumented, invisible by design, surviving by not asking questions. But the house had asked one anyway, and he couldn't ignore it now. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find out who Samuel was. Not because he owed the past anything, but because he knew too well what it cost when no one bothered to remember. Mateo barely slept, not because the house made noise, but because it didn't. The silence pressed against him, thick and deliberate, broken only by his own breathing and the occasional groan of it adjusting to the night air. Each time he drifted off, Samuel's name surfaced in his mind, not as a sound but as a weight, pulling him back into wakefulness. By dawn, his body gave up on rest altogether. He rose before the sun fully appeared. The sky outside washed in pale blue and gray. The house felt colder in the early morning, as if it had exhaled everything it was holding during the night. Mateo wrapped his jacket tighter around himself and made coffee on a single burner he'd salvaged from a thrift store weeks earlier. The bitter smell filled the kitchen, grounding him. Routine had always been his way back to control. As he drank, he replayed the clerk's indifference, the cashier's warning, the carved name. Samuel. It wasn't a common name for kids in his own childhood neighborhood, but it wasn't rare either. Still, paired with the drawings, it felt specific, personal. He decided his first stop would be the town library, not because he expected answers, but because it was one of the few places where questions were allowed without suspicion. The library sat on the main street, a brick building with a faded banner announcing a summer reading program long past its deadline. Inside, the air smelled of paper and disinfectant. A bell chimed softly as he entered, and an older man behind the desk looked up from his computer. He had thinning white hair and a posture that suggested years of leaning forward to help people who rarely said thank you. "Morning," the man said, voice gentle but curious. "Morning," Mateo replied, already scanning the room. "I was wondering if you have local records. Old newspapers, maybe?" The man nodded, standing slowly. "We keep archives downstairs. Microfilm mostly. What are you looking for?" Mateo hesitated. He had learned to be vague when details could cost him. "A house," he said finally, "on Maple Street. Used to belong to someone named Eleanor Carter." Recognition flickered across the man's face, subtle but unmistakable. "Carter Place," he murmured. "Haven't heard that name in a while." He gestured toward the stairs. "Come on, I'll show you." The basement was cooler, dimmer, lined with shelves that held decades of local history compressed into reels and boxes. The librarian introduced himself as Frank as he powered on one of the machines. "Town was bigger once," he said, almost to himself. "Factories closed. People left. Some stories just stopped. Mateo threaded the microfilm carefully, his fingers clumsy with unfamiliarity. Hours passed as he scrolled through birth announcements, school events, obituaries. Eleanor Carter appeared occasionally, volunteering at church, baking for fundraisers, teaching Sunday school. Always alone in the photos, always smiling, but in a way that seemed practiced. Then, in an issue from 23 years ago, he found it, a short article buried near the classifieds. Local child missing. The name beneath the headline made his breath catch. Samuel Carter, age 7. Last seen near his home on Maple Street. The article was sparse. Careful not to speculate. Police asked for information. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite. Eleanor Carter was quoted once. Her words restrained. He liked to draw. Mateo leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. Missing. Not dead. Not found. The space that word occupied felt familiar, a limbo between presence and absence. He scrolled further, heart pounding, searching for follow-ups. There were a few. Searches conducted. No leads. Eventually, the notices stopped. Frank stood behind him, silent until Mateo looked up. You didn't know, Frank said gently. Mateo shook his head. No. That house. After the boy disappeared, things changed. Frank continued. Eleanor stopped coming around. Folks try to help. But grief does strange things. Makes people withdraw. Did they ever find out what happened? Mateo asked, though he already suspected the answer. Frank sighed. No. Officially, anyway. He hesitated, then added, there were rumors. Always are. Some thought he ran off. Others, he trailed off, eyes flicking away. Small towns can be cruel when they don't have answers. Mateo thanked him quietly and left with copies of the articles folded carefully in his jacket pocket. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, the world too loud. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere down the street. Life continuing, indifferent to the weight he carried back with him. On the walk home, his thoughts tangled with his own memories. He remembered being 14, sitting on a bus bench with his backpack at his feet, watching families pass by without seeing him. Missing, he thought now, wasn't just about disappearance. It was about being overlooked while still breathing. Back in the house, Mateo laid the photocopies on the kitchen counter and stared at them until the words blurred. He felt a pull toward the closet again, but he resisted, choosing instead to explore the attic. The ladder groaned as he climbed, dust raining down with each step. The attic smelled of insulation and old cardboard, a graveyard of things no one had wanted enough to keep. In the far corner, beneath a torn tarp, he found a small wooden box. It wasn't locked. Inside were crayons, worn-down nubs, and a stack of folded papers. Drawings. More houses. More figures. Sometimes 2. Sometimes 3. In many, one was scribbled over, not with anger this time, but with careful, deliberate strokes, as if trying to erase without tearing. At the bottom of the box was a notebook. Mateo opened it slowly, half expecting it to crumble. Inside were Eleanor's words, written in tight, slanted handwriting. Not a diary exactly. Lists, reminders, and then pages and pages addressed to Samuel. Apologies, memories, please. She wrote about the day he disappeared without explaining it, as if the act of naming it was too painful. She wrote about guilt, about people whispering, about not being believed. One line stood out, underlined so deeply it tore the page. I should have stayed. Mateo closed the notebook, his hands shaking. The emotional shift came suddenly, unexpectedly. This wasn't just a mystery to solve anymore. It was a wound that had never closed, mirrored too closely to his own. He had spent years believing survival meant moving on, not looking back. But Eleanor had stayed, physically at least, and it had nearly destroyed her. As evening approached, clouds gathered again, the air heavy with the promise of another storm. Mateo sat on the attic floor, the box beside him, listening to the first drops hit the roof. He felt torn between two instincts: to protect himself by disengaging, and to honor something fragile by seeing it through. He thought about Samuel's drawings, about the erased figure, about Eleanor's regret carved into paper and walls. He thought about his own life, the way he avoided attachments because they made leaving harder. And he realized that by buying this house, by uncovering these remnants, he had already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The storm broke fully, thunder rattling the windows, rain pounding with a force that felt almost accusatory. Mateo descended the ladder, carrying the box carefully, as if it might break if handled too roughly. He placed it in the living room, then stood there, unsure what to do next. One thing was clear now. Samuel hadn't just vanished. His story had been silenced, buried under discomfort and time. And Mateo, undocumented and unwanted by systems designed to exclude him, had somehow become its keeper. As the lights flickered with the storm, Mateo made a quiet decision that scared him more than any creak in the house. He wouldn't sell this place. He wouldn't walk away. Not yet. If Samuel's story was going to survive, someone had to stay long enough to carry it forward. The storm lingered into the night, not violent anymore, just persistent. Rain slid down the windows in uneven trails, distorting the outside world into something distant and unreachable. Mateo sat on the floor of the living room with a wooden box open in front of him, the drawing spread carefully like fragile evidence. He felt exposed, as if by touching these things he had made himself visible to something larger than his own life. He picked up one drawing at a time, studying the details he'd missed before. Samuel's houses were always the same shape, a simple square, a triangle roof, a door slightly off-center. Windows were uneven, sometimes too big, sometimes missing entirely. In many of them, one window was shaded darker than the others. Mateo realized with a jolt that it matched the closet room, the sealed space, the place where memory had been hidden. His chest tightened again, but this time the feeling carried clarity. Whatever had happened to Samuel hadn't happened far away. It had happened inside these walls. The house wasn't just a backdrop to the loss. It was part of it. Mateo stood and walked slowly down the hallway, stopping in front of the closet. The cloth he draped over the scraped wall fluttered slightly with a draft he couldn't feel anywhere else. He pulled it aside and crouched, running his fingers along the carved name again. Samuel. He imagined Eleanor carving it late at night, hands shaking, pressing hard as if pain could anchor her to the truth everyone else seemed eager to forget. He thought of the line she'd written, "I should have stayed," and wondered where she had gone instead. Mentally, emotionally, because physically, she never left this house. The next morning, Mateo woke with a sense of urgency that overpowered his usual caution. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like an obligation. He showered quickly, the water barely warm, and changed into clean clothes. As he locked the door behind him, he hesitated, glancing back at the house as if asking permission. Then he headed toward the one place he'd been avoiding, Eleanor Carter's church. It stood at the edge of town, white-painted with peeling in long strips, a modest building that had seen better decades. Mateo arrived mid-morning, when the parking lot was mostly empty. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old hymnals. A woman arranging flowers near the altar looked up as he entered. She was in her early 60s, hair pulled back tightly, movements efficient but tense. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm looking for information about Eleanor Carter," Mateo said, keeping his voice steady. "I live in her old house." The woman froze, just for a second. Then she set the flowers down carefully. "I'm Ruth," she said. "Eleanor taught my son Sunday school." Something in her voice shifted when she said the name. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to unresolved discomfort. Mateo felt it immediately. "I found some things in the house," he continued, "about Samuel. Ruth's shoulders slumped as if the effort of holding herself upright had finally exhausted her. She gestured toward a pew. "Sit," she said quietly. They sat side by side, leaving space between them. Ruth stared straight ahead as she spoke. Samuel wasn't her son, not biologically. Mateo turned to her, surprised. "Then who was he?" "A foster child," Ruth said. "Temporary placement." They said, "His parents, well, it was complicated." She exhaled slowly. Eleanor wasn't supposed to get attached, but she did. Everyone could see it. "What happened?" Mateo asked. Ruth clasped her hands together tightly. "The state came one afternoon. Said they were moving him. New placement. Better fit." Her jaw tightened. Eleanor begged them to let him stay. Said he needed stability. They said rules were rules. Mateo felt a familiar anger rise in him, hot and bitter. Rules. He knew that word too well. "They took him?" he asked. Ruth nodded. That was the plan. "But Samuel," he ran. "Hid. We thought he'd gone with them at first. By the time anyone realized, it was too late." She swallowed. "They searched everywhere." Mateo's mind raced. "But he didn't leave the house," he said, more statement than question. Ruth looked at him then, really looked at him. "You found the closet?" "Yes." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Eleanor always said he liked small spaces, said they felt safe to him. Her voice cracked. When they came for him, she wasn't home. She'd gone to town. She told herself she had time. The words hit Mateo like a physical blow. I should have stayed. The regret suddenly had shape. Eleanor hadn't failed because she didn't love Samuel. She'd failed because she trusted a system that didn't wait. "What do you think happened?" Mateo asked softly. Ruth hesitated, then spoke in a whisper. "I think Samuel hid in that closet. I think he got scared. I think—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Mateo filled in the silence with his own understanding. A child hiding. A door closed. Time passing. Panic turning into something worse. His stomach twisted painfully. "Why didn't anyone check?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because everyone assumed he'd left," Ruth said. "Because it was easier." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of shared guilt settling between them. Ruth finally stood. "Eleanor never forgave herself," she said. "She stopped letting people in, stopped trusting institutions. By the time anyone questioned the official story, years had passed." Mateo thanked her and left, his legs heavy as if he were walking through water. Outside, the sky was overcast again, the light muted. He walked home slowly, replaying every word. Samuel hadn't been erased out of malice. He'd been erased out of convenience, out of discomfort, out of a collective need to move on. Back in the house, Mateo went straight to the closet. He opened it fully and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The darkness was immediate, thick. He crouched, imagining a small body tucked into the corner, holding breath, waiting. The space felt unbearably tight now, suffocating. Mateo pushed the door open and stumbled out, gasping. His heart raced, not just from imagined fear, but from the realization settling into him. Samuel's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy of the past. It was a failure carried forward by everyone who chose not to look too closely, including Eleanor, including the town, including systems Mateo had learned to fear and avoid. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, and let the emotion wash through him. Anger, grief, recognition. He had spent years avoiding attention because attention could get him deported, erased in a different way. But now he understood the cost of silence. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like it was waiting. It felt like it was watching him, measuring what he would do next. Mateo wiped his face and stood, a new resolve hardening in his chest. He didn't know how yet or what would cost him, but he knew one thing with certainty. Samuel's story would not remain sealed, not if Mateo had anything to say about it. That night, Mateo didn't turn off the light in the hallway. He told himself it was practical, that the wiring was old, and he didn't trust sudden darkness. But he knew the truth. Leaving the light on made the house feel less like a witness and more like companion. He slept in fragments, waking often, each time disoriented by the sense that time inside the house didn't move the same way it did outside. By morning, the decision he'd made the day before had settled into something heavier. Intent. Mateo moved through the house with it pressing against his ribs as he cleaned, not out of necessity, but out of respect. He swept floors that hadn't been touched in years, wiped down surfaces layered with dust, opened windows despite the cold to let the air circulate. With each small act, the house seemed to loosen, like muscles unclenching after a long hold. In the closet, he worked carefully. He removed the remaining paint around the carved name and the faint drawings beneath, exposing them fully for the first time in decades. The plaster was rough, uneven, marked by years of neglect. He didn't try to fix it. Repair, he felt, could wait. First came acknowledgement. As he stepped back to look at the wall, an unexpected emotion surfaced. Something like pride, but quieter. He had spent most of his life invisible by necessity, blending in, passing through spaces without leaving marks. Now here he was, uncovering someone else's mark, refusing to let it be smoothed over again. The irony didn't escape him. The practical questions followed quickly. What did one do with a story like this? Mateo wasn't a citizen. He didn't trust police, social services, or any authority that required paperwork and proof of belonging. Going public meant exposure. Exposure meant risk. Deportation wasn't an abstract fear. It was a shadow that followed every decision he made. That afternoon, he sat at the small kitchen table with Eleanor's notebook open in front of him. He read her words slowly this time, not as clues but as confessions. She wrote about Samuel's laugh, about how he lined up his shoes perfectly by the door, about his fear of loud voices. She wrote about the day he arrived with a trash bag of clothes and eyes too old for his face. And again, she wrote about staying, or failing to. Mateo felt something shift as he read. Eleanor's regret wasn't passive. It was active, corrosive. She had survived Samuel, but survival without repair had hollowed her out. Mateo recognized that too. He'd survived his own abandonment, but at the cost of connection, of permanence. Reading her words felt like looking into a future he didn't want. He folded the notebook closed and stood, pacing the length of the kitchen. The rain returned, light but steady, tapping against a window in a rhythm that felt almost insistent. Finally, he grabbed his jacket. There was one more person he needed to talk to. Frank was at the library again, sorting returned books with slow precision. He looked up when Mateo entered, concern crossing his face almost immediately. "You find something," he said, not asking. "Yes," Mateo replied, "and I need advice." They sat at a small table near the back, away from the windows. Mateo spoke carefully, choosing his words like stepping stones across deep water. He didn't mention his status. He didn't need to. He talked about the drawings, the notebook, Ruth's account, about Samuel hiding, about the closet. Frank listened without interrupting, his hands folded tightly together. When Mateo finished, the older man closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of it all. "There were whispers back then," he said quietly, "but no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. What happens if I do?" Mateo asked. Frank studied him. "Truth has consequences," he said, "but silence has its own." Mateo nodded. "If I go to the police?" Frank shook his head. "They'll ask why now. They'll ask who you are. They'll reopen things in ways that may not bring peace." He hesitated. "But there are other ways." "Like what?" "Like memory," Frank said. "Like record. Like making sure Samuel's name doesn't disappear again." Frank explained that the town had a small historical society, mostly volunteers, mostly retirees who documented old buildings, family histories, forgotten events. It wasn't official in the way Mateo feared, but it wasn't nothing either. Stories preserved there didn't vanish easily. It wouldn't be justice, Frank said, but it would be acknowledgement. Mateo felt torn. Part of him wanted accountability, a clear line between cause and consequence. Another part, older, more tired, understood that some wrongs couldn't be corrected without causing new ones. Eleanor was gone. The people who made the decision to remove Samuel had moved on. What remained was a choice of whether his existence mattered enough to be remembered. On the walk home, Mateo passed children playing in the front yard, their laughter sharp against the gray day. He watched them for a moment longer than necessary, a tightness forming in his throat. He wondered who would remember them if something went wrong. Who would stay? That night, he returned to the attic and carefully repacked the box. Drawings, crayons, notebook. He added one more thing, a handwritten note of his own. Simple, honest. He wrote Samuel's name again, and beneath it, the dates he could confirm, leaving a blank where certainty ended. He wrote, "You were here. You mattered." As he closed the box, the emotional shift came fully into focus. Mateo realized this wasn't just about Samuel or Eleanor. It was about choosing to be present in a way he'd avoided his entire adult life. Staying didn't just mean occupying space. It meant bearing witness, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it cost something. He placed the box back in the attic, but not hidden this time. He set it near the ladder, accessible, visible. Then he went downstairs and stood in the living room, listening to the house at rest. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Mateo sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and allowed himself a small, fragile hope. Maybe telling the story wouldn't undo the past, but it might keep it from disappearing again. And maybe, in doing so, he could learn how to stay in his own life, too. The first real risk came quietly. It arrived not as a threat, but as an envelope slipped halfway under Mateo's front door 3 days later. No stamp, no return address, just his name, written in block letters that felt overly careful, like someone trying not to reveal themselves. Mateo noticed it only because he was sweeping the porch, another small ritual he'd adopted to keep his hands busy. He froze when he saw it. For years, unexpected mail had meant danger, missed paperwork, warnings, things he didn't fully understand but knew could unravel his life. His first instinct was to ignore it, let it sit there as if unopened mail couldn't hurt him. But that instinct collided with the new one forming inside him, the one that refused to look away. He picked up the envelope and went inside, locking the door behind him. Inside was a single sheet of paper. People should stop digging into things that don't belong to them. No signature, no explanation. Mateo sat down hard on the couch, his pulse loud in his ears. The house, moments ago calm, felt alert again. This wasn't coincidence. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone cared enough to warn him off. The realization triggered something deep and familiar, the survival reflex that had kept him alive since he was 14. Don't draw attention. Don't cause trouble. Don't stay long enough to be noticed. For several minutes, he seriously considered leaving. Selling the house wouldn't be hard. Even abandoned places had value when flipped cheaply. He could pack his backpack again, move to another town, disappear the way he always had. Samuel's story would slide back into silence, but Mateo would be safe. That was the trade-off he had accepted his entire adult life. But the thought of sealing the closet again made his chest ache. That afternoon, Mateo forced himself outside. He needed air, distance from the house's watchful stillness. He walked the neighborhood slowly, noting details he previously ignored. Curtains twitching behind windows, a man fixing a fence who watched him a beat too long, a woman on a porch who smiled politely but didn't wave back. He couldn't tell whether he was imagining it or finally seeing what had always been there. Social pressure, he realized, didn't always shout. Sometimes it just waited. At the grocery store, the cashier from before rang him up again. This time, she leaned closer as she handed him his receipt. "You stirring up old stories?" she asked softly. Mateo met her eyes. I'm trying to understand one. She sighed. This town doesn't like mirrors. Then quieter. Be careful who you trust. Back home, Mateo called Frank from the library. He didn't mention the note at first, only asked how the Historical Society documented things. Frank listened, then asked a question that landed heavier than any warning. You willing to put your name on this? He asked. Mateo stared at the wall, where Samuel's name was carved beneath layers of paint. I don't know if I can, he said honestly. That's all right, Frank replied. But understand this. Stories don't stay anonymous forever. Someone always ends up carrying the weight. That night, Mateo couldn't sit still. He went back into the closet and measured the space carefully. The dimensions confirmed what his body already knew. It was too small, too sealed. He found old hinges on the door that suggested it had once locked from the outside, a detail that made his stomach turn. Not malicious design, perhaps, but neglect compounded by fear. The next day, he did something that terrified him more than the anonymous note. He knocked on Ruth's door. She opened it slowly, recognition dawning and tightening her expression at the same time. You shouldn't be here, she said, though she stepped aside to let him in. I got a warning, Mateo told her, holding up the envelope. Ruth's face drained of color. Some people never forgave Eleanor, she said. Others never forgave themselves. Did anyone ever suspect what really happened? Mateo asked. Ruth nodded once. A few of us did, but suspicion isn't proof, and proof requires courage. Her voice wavered, which we lacked. They sat in her kitchen, the clock ticking loudly between them. Ruth admitted her own regret then, the one she'd carried quietly for decades. She had suggested checking the house thoroughly back then. She'd been dismissed, and she hadn't pushed. I stayed silent, she said, eyes wet, because it was easier. The words echoed Eleanor's, echoed Mateo's life. That evening, back in the house, Mateo made his choice. He didn't call the police. He didn't go online. Instead, he began documenting everything meticulously. Photographs of the wall, scans of the drawings, typed transcriptions of Eleanor's notebook. He worked through the night, powered by a grim clarity. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about permanence. Near dawn, he wrote a final document, a narrative account, restrained and factual, naming Samuel, naming the house, naming what was known and what wasn't. He left out speculation. He let the silence speak where certainty ended. When he finished, he saved copies in multiple places and handed one sealed envelope to Frank later that morning. If something happens to me, Mateo said quietly, don't let this disappear. Frank looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. You're staying, he said. Mateo didn't correct him. As he walked home, the fear didn't vanish, but it changed. It no longer pushed him to run. It sharpened his awareness, grounded him in the present. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of being seen and chose not to flinch. That night, Mateo sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the house settle. He placed his hand flat against the wall near the hallway, not the closet, but close enough. I'm here, he whispered, unsure who he was speaking to. The house creaked softly in response, and for once, it didn't sound like a warning. The knock came 2 mornings later. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 firm taps that carried through the house with unsettling clarity. Mateo was at the kitchen table, laptop open, rereading what he'd written for the Historical Society. His body reacted before his mind did. Muscles tightened, breath stalled. Every instinct screamed to stay still and silent, to let the visitor assume no one was home. But the taps came again. Mateo closed the laptop slowly and stood. As he moved toward the door, a strange calm settled over him. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. He had crossed the threshold already. Avoidance would only confirm what people feared, that this story was dangerous because it was true. He opened the door. A man stood on the porch, mid-40s, neatly dressed in a jacket that was too formal for the neighborhood. His hair was peppered with gray, his expression carefully neutral. He held a folder under one arm. "Mateo Alvarez?" the man asked. Mateo nodded, heart pounding. "My name is Thomas Green," the man said. "I work with the county. Property records, zoning, that sort of thing." His eyes flicked briefly past Mateo. "Into the house. May I come in?" Every alarm bell went off at once. Mateo knew enough to be afraid of anyone official who asked politely, but he also knew that refusing would raise questions he didn't want. He stepped aside. Thomas entered slowly, taking in the room with measured interest. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the clean surfaces, the open windows. "I live here," Mateo replied. "Yes," Thomas said. "About that." He opened his folder, pulling out papers Mateo didn't try to read. There have been concerns from neighbors about renovations without permits, structural alterations. "I haven't altered anything," Mateo said evenly. Thomas smiled thinly. "That's what I'm here to verify." They walked down the hallway together. Each step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the closet, Thomas stopped. "This room," he said. "You've been spending time here." It wasn't a question. Mateo met his gaze. "I found something." Thomas exhaled, as if relieved to finally drop the pretense. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "I know what you found. Or at least, I know what you think you found." He leaned closer. "This town has made its peace with the past." Mateo felt something harden in his chest. "By forgetting? By surviving," Thomas corrected. "Dragging this up doesn't help anyone. Not Eleanor. Not the boy. Not you." The casual dismissal made Mateo's hand shake. "Samuel," he said. His name was Samuel. Thomas's jaw tightened. For the first time, emotion cracked his controlled demeanor. "You don't understand the damage this could do," he said. "People lost jobs back then. Reputations. Lawsuits were threatened. The county made decisions to protect itself. And a child died," Mateo said quietly. Silence filled the narrow hallway, thick and charged. Thomas straightened. "You're not from here," he said. "You don't know how fragile this place is. We can't afford." "You couldn't afford to look," Mateo interrupted. His voice surprised even him. It was steady, certain. "And now you're asking me to help you keep not looking." Thomas stared at him for a long moment. Then he closed his folder. "I'm advising you," he said, tone hardening. "Stop, for your own good." After he left, the house felt colder. Mateo sat on the floor for a long time, back against the wall, replaying every word. Thomas hadn't threatened him directly, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about memory anymore. It was about power, about who got to decide which stories were dangerous. That night, Mateo didn't sleep at all. Instead, he made a call he'd been avoiding, to an immigration clinic 2 towns over, a place Frank had quietly mentioned weeks ago just in case. The woman on the phone spoke gently but didn't sugarcoat anything. Public exposure carried risk. Documentation could protect him, but it wouldn't make him invisible. When the call ended, Mateo sat in the dark, the weight of choice pressing down on him. He thought of Eleanor, alone in this house, surviving but hollowed out. He thought of Ruth, knowing and staying silent. He thought of Samuel, hiding, trusting the world to come back for him. And he thought of himself at 14, standing on a sidewalk with a backpack and no plan, waiting for anyone, to notice he hadn't disappeared on purpose. By morning, the decision was made. Mateo didn't go to the Historical Society first. He went to the house itself. He removed the closet door, not violently, not in anger. He unscrewed the hinges carefully, setting the door aside and opening the space fully to the hallway. Light poured in, revealing the cramped interior without shadows. The carved name, the drawings, the worn floor, all visible now. Unhidden. It felt like holding a breath for decades and finally exhaling. Next, he invited Ruth over. Then Frank. Then, quietly, a few others who had lived in the town long enough to remember the whispers but never said them out loud. He didn't dramatize. He didn't accuse. He showed them what was there and let silence do the rest. Some cried. Some couldn't look. One man left abruptly, muttering about the past being the past. But no one denied it. Word spread anyway, not through headlines or social media, but the old way, through conversations, uncomfortable questions, late-night realizations. The county couldn't pretend forever when the house itself contradicted the story it had settled on. A week later, a small, unofficial gathering formed in the living room. No cameras, no speeches, just people standing quietly, facing the open closet, acknowledging what had been avoided for too long. Mateo stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, heart pounding. He hadn't planned to speak. But when Ruth stepped forward and said, "We failed him," something broke open inside him. "He wasn't ours," she continued, voice trembling. "But we were supposed to be his." The room was silent again. That was when Mateo realized the risk he'd taken had already changed something irreversible. Not the past, but the present. The town couldn't unknow this. And neither could he. Later that night, alone again, Mateo sat in the doorway of the closet. Now just another small room. The fear hadn't vanished. The uncertainty about his future remained sharp and real. But beneath it all was something new. Belonging, not granted by papers or permission, but forged by staying when it mattered. The house was quiet, no longer paused. It felt settled, as if a long-held tension had finally released. Mateo rested his head against the wall and closed his eyes. One more step remained. One final truth to uncover, to place properly, to carry forward. And he knew, with calm certainty, that he wouldn't walk away before finishing. The excavation happened on a Tuesday morning, under a sky so ordinary it felt almost cruel. There were no sirens, no television crews, no official banners. Just 2 county workers, an aging backhoe, and a small group of people standing at a careful distance in the overgrown yard behind the house. The county called it a property safety inspection. No one said Samuel's name out loud, but everyone there knew why the soil was about to be turned. Mateo stood near the back fence, hands deep in his jacket pockets, heart hammering away that had nothing to do with fear for himself. The risk he'd taken, exposure, retaliation, uncertainty, had already happened. This moment was about something else entirely. It was about whether staying had been enough. Ruth stood a few feet away, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Frank was beside her, holding a folder he didn't open. No one spoke as the machine lowered its bucket into the earth for the first time. The sound of metal biting into soil carried through the yard, sharp and final. Mateo looked at the house instead. From the outside, it looked almost peaceful now. Windows clean, porch swept, the closet door gone, replaced by openness and light. He thought of Eleanor in her later years, moving through these same rooms alone, carrying a knowledge she couldn't prove and a guilt no one wanted to hear. He understood now that her isolation hadn't been punishment. It had been consequence. The first discovery came quietly. One of the workers stopped a machine and waved the other over. They crouched, brushing dirt away by hand. A small object emerged, plastic, faded blue, a toy shoe. Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, not quite a gasp. Mateo felt his knees weaken, the ground seeming to tilt beneath him. The air felt thin, hard to draw into his lungs. He had imagined this moment 100 ways, but none of them prepared him for how gentle it was, how undeniable. More items followed. Fabric, buttons, and finally, remains. No one rushed. No one spoke. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance. The county workers stepped back, hats in their hands. The unspoken truth settled over the group, like a held breath finally released. Samuel had not run away. He had not vanished into some unknowable elsewhere. He had been here. The whole time, waiting. Mateo felt something inside him break, not violently, but cleanly, like a knot finally loosening after years of tension. Tears came without warning, hot and unstoppable. He didn't bother wiping them away. For once, he didn't feel the need to be careful with his emotions. Later, the findings were documented properly. A quiet reclassification. A reopened case that didn't search for blame so much as accuracy. The county issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging oversights. No apologies, no names named, but the record changed, and that mattered more than Mateo had expected. Samuel Carter was no longer missing. He was found. A small memorial took shape in the weeks that followed. Not a grand monument, just a wooden bench beneath the old maple tree in the yard, place where sunlight reached it in the afternoon. Someone left flowers. Someone else left crayons. Mateo added one of Samuel's drawings, laminated, protected from the weather. 2 figures under a crooked roof. This time, no one crossed out. The town didn't transform overnight. It didn't suddenly become kinder or braver. But something shifted. Conversations changed tone. Silences grew heavier, less comfortable. People began to question other stories they'd accepted too easily. That was the real consequence Thomas Green had feared. Not scandal, but reflection. Mateo's life didn't become simpler. There were still risks, still paperwork, still days when a knock at the door made his chest tighten. But something fundamental had changed. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was rooted. Frank helped him connect with a legal aid group that specialized in long-term residents. Ruth stopped by every Sunday with soup, never saying much, but staying long enough that the house felt fuller. Neighbors waved now. Some avoided him. Both felt honest. One evening, months later, Mateo sat alone in the living room as dusk settled in. The house creaked softly, the familiar language of wood and age. He thought about the 14-year-old boy he'd been, kicked out with a backpack and a warning not to return. He thought about Samuel, trusting that someone would come back for him if he waited long enough. And he thought about Eleanor. Mateo visited her grave one quiet afternoon, standing before the modest headstone that bore her name and dates. He placed a small stone on top, then hesitated before speaking. "He's remembered now," he said softly. "I stayed." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound away. Mateo didn't expect an answer. Some things didn't need one. That night, back in the house, he stood in the doorway of the former closet. Now just a small reading nook with a lamp and a chair. The wall still bore Samuel's name, preserved behind clear sealant. Not hidden, not erased. Mateo sat down and opened Eleanor's notebook one last time. He read the underlined sentence again, "I should have stayed." He closed the book gently. "You did," he whispered, "just not long enough." He stayed there for a while, listening to the house breathe, feeling the quiet warmth of a story finally allowed to rest. He understood now that some stories don't survive because they're loud or powerful or convenient. They survive because someone ordinary chooses to stop running. Because someone stays. If this story moved you, subscribe for more slow, human stories about memory, survival, and the quiet courage it takes to stay when it matters.